Hey! It's so good to see you guys. I'm sorry it's been so long. I've had a really busy month and a lot of crazy stuff has happened. I regrew my beard, but it grew back with a patch. Really nasty right there, which has never happened before. So I might be going face bald, and if I go face bald, I'm quitting the internet forever. But I wanted to show you guys something that I found while you were gone. Oh, not that, sorry. I found this. This is a VHS tape. It's how people recorded video when I was young. Instead of being digital, they physically put the video recording on this strand of tape on the back, and then a machine would play that back. The quality was disgustingly terrible, but it was extremely convenient, which is why it beat out Betamax. But I'm not here to tell you guys about the technology of this tape, but rather, what's on it. Come on.
Coming up next is your second chance to watch this week's Blues Clues, because the more preschoolers watch, the more they learn, and the more they know.
By the early 90s, children's programming had expanded to limits which likely would have been seen as impossible only a few decades earlier. Corporate tie-ins meant that many new channels featured shows which attempted to appeal to young and imaginative children. But there was a catch. Most of these shows often were justified by the selling of toys, meaning that they could be shockingly violent. And many parents and media experts complained that outside of PBS, there was a strong lack of educational content which entertained children without such negative influences. Laws passed by Congress and later enforced by organizations like the FCC demanded that networks strive to make better content for young children, especially during early morning hours. In response to this, Nickelodeon began working on Nick Jr., their new block of programming that would appeal exclusively to preschool audience members. The main contribution to this block would be a new show being produced in New York. Originally titled Blue's Prince, it would feature an animated blue cat that would help the audience figure out puzzles and learn new things. The creators soon learned that Nickelodeon had already started work on a show with a similar animal, which I have to presume to be Pilchard from Bob the Builder. And so Blue was soon turned into a dog. The show took its main inspiration from PBS's Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which is near universally considered to be the greatest children's program of all time. The show featured a caring and fatherly host who would greet the audience as if he were actually in the room with them, as he would teach them facts about household items before transitioning into the neighborhood of make-believe, where numerous memorable characters would live out dramatic scenarios while teaching the audience various lessons. Although there are pretty clearly many differences between the two shows. The most obvious of these is that Blue's Clues is slightly less worthy of having its set placed in a museum. But in order to make their own version of the neighborhood of make-believe, Blue's Clues would need their very own Fred Rogers. And after auditioning thousands of potential hosts, they found their lead in Steve Burns, a scrappy skateboarder and wannabe musician who they filmed a pilot with after politely asking him to get a haircut. And the rest is television history. Every episode of Blue's Clues starts with Steve addressing the audience as if they were an old friend visiting for the day. And he ends up positing to them a confusion or mystery surrounding his dog, who is very intelligent but can't talk, which triggers Blue to begin leaving clues on various items throughout his house. Steve and the audience go on a grand adventure throughout the various rooms, where he eventually finds all 3 clues and figures out exactly how they go together. This taught audience members 2 very important skills: problem solving and creativity. As Steve would collect together things like water, tape, and 2 empty bottles, we would all just be stuck in a trance trying to figure out just how these things fit together. No longer were these all separate items, but pieces to some larger puzzle that we and we alone could solve. And the moment Steve used these to make a big artificial tornado in his very own living room, we all jumped up to make it ourselves, resulting in millions of parents having to clean up identical messes caused by overactive children and very subpar tape. At least once every few episodes, the cropping on Steve's footage will end up just short of the animation, something that's very easy to notice on a modern 16:9 screen, but would have been nearly undetectable on the sorts of televisions that existed around the turn of the century. These are blemishes that are extremely easy to point out and notice as an adult, but most children didn't have the ability to notice such things, as we were all just too busy being sucked up into the story that was unwinding during every episode.
But studying the structure of Blue's Clues alone isn't enough, because as with most things, the most important factor is the people we meet along the way. Isn't that right, Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head? I so desperately want what you two have.
As Steve searched for the 3 clues that he would need for each episode, he would additionally run into various characters who he would go on various side quests with. Sometimes that would be as simple as him chatting with Salt and Pepper or Shovel and Pail, and other times he would skidoo into pocket dimensions held in photos and miniature dioramas, such as Recycle Town or The Jungle, and one time, the entire frickin' galaxy. Steve's house is in a book on a table, and our world is just a picture on his wall. We have created him, yet he holds our very reality in a frame, as if it were some novelty. The main purpose of these detours would be to teach the audience something additional to the main part of the episode. For instance, the Galaxy segment taught the children to remember the names of all the planets through a very catchy song. Other episodes taught you how to recycle, or how to recognize patterns, and so on. The patterns, mainly. If you were to succeed in learning these things, you were rewarded with validation from Steve and maybe even a song. Something which you so desperately wanted. Now, in reality, Steve would talk to you the same no matter what you did. But it certainly didn't feel that way. It felt like he could actually hear us, and that we had these adventures not because he was our teacher, but because he was our best friend. And it was his friends that made this world seem so three-dimensional, despite literally being the opposite. Shovel and Pail would hang out in the backyard and teach Steve and Blue about anything that made sense in that setting, playing with a magnifying glass, bugs, building a sandcastle, that sort of thing. Mailbox would then appear and deliver Steve a letter from a young audience member. These clips would always tie into the stories, teaching audiences additional things about time, or rhymes, or Marxist theory, or whatever. Salt and Pepper were French diplomats who would teach the audience about nutrition and food, although it was always a little unsettling that none of the other foodstuffs they ever interacted with were also alive.
Where? Forgotten Sprinkles? Where?
One of the most memorable storylines of the show was the birth of Paprika during the Season 1 finale, a character who changed the dynamic of the household but was welcomed into their family with open arms, something I'm sure that the writers hoped that the audience at home would learn to do in return.
Indeed, one of the most important factors about Blue's Clues is that all of these characters were friends and could depend on and loved each other like a family would. And that's something that everyone at home could deeply relate to, or at the very least, wish that they could. We just got a letter. We just got a letter. It's another death threat.
On April 29th, 2002, a 3-episode event, almost like a miniature film, premiered on Nickelodeon. The storyline started with Steve trying to find something for show and tell, only to then get a call as he was pulled away from the audience. He then turned back to announce that Joe, his younger brother and a former cast member of Fox's Power Rangers in Space, was going to be visiting for the day. This wasn't too irregular. We sort of got used to hanging out with other people whenever we went to see Steve. Miranda was always there, and it was like, hey, she's fine. It's just like, I'm here to see Steve, lady. But when Joe showed up, things felt different. Joe wasn't just stopping by. He was helping Steve look for clues full time. And as things progressed, this only felt more and more unsettling to the audience. The second episode of this storyline featured Blue wanting to give Joe a gift, with the two deciding to play Blue's Clues to figure out what that gift was. Through the episode, they gather paper, a crayon, and a spiral shape, and it doesn't take a lot of time in the thinking chair for Joe to figure out that Blue was describing the handy-dandy notebook itself.
So Blue wants to give Joe a notebook.
This clip is pure concentrated anxiety converted into a video form, but it's also super cathartic, and I don't know how to explain that discrepancy to you. Yes, the end of Season 4 brought with it the exit of Steve and the entrance of Joe, a storyline which is so infamous that it's probably what the show is mostly known for at this point. But to understand why this all had to play out, we have to look at the show from a totally different perspective.
Hi. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Kevin. Okay. From about 1995, 96 until about 2002, I had the great fortune of being the host of Nickelodeon's Blues Clues. I see many of you were 5 in 1998.
Earlier in this very video, I made a direct comparison between the presentation of Blue's Clues and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I was right to do so, because both are very similar in terms of how they speak to their audiences and the kinds of things that they were trying to encourage. But there's one big difference between the two, which is admittedly kind of obvious, but is also seriously worth analyzing. That being that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was made by a man who was notorious for being open and honest with his audience about most everything. Most of the behind-the-scenes stories revolving around the real Fred Rogers reveal that offset he was nearly identical to his on-screen persona, mainly in that his emphatic empathy translated off-screen as well. Steve Burns is an entirely different conversation. When he first auditioned for the show, he was asked to change his appearance to more closely resemble what the producers intended for his persona. He was then illustrated as someone bright and cheerful, gallivanting all over the screen at the drop of a hat or the arrival of a letter, and interacting with all of the elements as instructed by the directors. Steve was an actor. He was playing a character who was purposefully intended to come across as a real person to his audience. As he would later explain, this would cause a great deal of personal confusion and worry in his mind.
My favorite part of the show, my job in the show, was to talk directly through the camera. And to actually cultivate, if I could, a relationship with an individual child through a TV. The conceit being that I can hear them and that they can hear me. And that's tricky. And what we found out is that it totally worked. And kids thought I was their friend, for real. Like millions of them. And I thought, oh. Despite how wonderful it was, the more popular it became, the more that started to weigh on me. For real, I started to think, I'm saying these wonderful things to kids. I'm saying, you are so smart, and you can do anything that you want to do. I couldn't help thinking, is that true? Am I saying the right things to all of these children? It felt like a really tremendous responsibility. And on top of that, my name on the show was Steve, and my name in real life is Steve. It was becoming this sort of thing where people assumed I created the show, and it was this indelible thing. Like I wore the same shirt every time. It's like a very iconic thing on purpose, and it was in multiple countries now. And I had moved to New York to be Serpico, really. I was going to fail privately, or I was going to be Al Pacino, and that was it. And now this thing was happening. And it was getting huge, and I didn't expect any of this. I didn't even know any children when I moved to New York. I'm really worried. Like, am I the right guy for this job? My contract was up for renewal, and I was starting to really seriously think they might have the wrong guy here. Maybe this should be a teacher or a child development specialist or something. And I was seriously thinking, I'm having an identity crisis, and maybe I shouldn't do this. And then I became one of People Magazine's most eligible bachelors. And that sounded good.
Steve Burns is seriously one of the most fascinating public figures that I grew up knowing during my childhood. These clips are all taken from a set he did around 9 years ago, telling stories about working on the show, and it's probably one of the most memorable, funny, and beautiful descriptions of the life of an actor that I've ever seen. As I was working on this video, I tried really hard to talk about all these anecdotes, but I realized that the only way that I could possibly do that would be to just play the entire set, or to ruin them by describing them in my own words. Probably the most touching of these is near the end, when Steve describes the work that he ended up doing for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. As it turns out, many sick children, when presented with any possible wish in the world, asked if they could see their friend Steve.
This is complicated for me because I also am aware that this child chose me. Right? Like me, that's what they want, right? And I'm not sure what me is me. Am I Steve Burns? Am I Steve with the shirt? Who's me? I don't know which one it is, right? So it's really complicated. But that helped me realize that whether I wanted it to be true or not, whether I expected it to be true or not, the answer was both.
Despite initially feeling unsure about his role in the show, Steve continued to appear for some time after this. This was until 2002, when he decided that it was finally time to leave. His choice wasn't driven by anything deeply emotional or psychological, but by his hairline. Steve was going bald, and as he's explained numerous times, losing all of his hair on a national children's television program was not something that he planned on doing. But I think that his impending hair loss actually represents something larger about his situation. That being that he was about to enter his 30s, and it was going to end up feeling a little odd playing a character who was meant to have the mentality of a child as he continued to age and mature. Steve could feel that within a few years, Blue's Clues would become something that he would feel awkward continuing to do, so he decided to quit before any of that started happening. And thus, Joe came into being. He was played by actor Donovan Patton, and was presumably given a different name from his performer to spare him from the same existential collapse that his predecessor had gone through previously. And of course, we got the 3-episode storyline transitioning between the two hosts, showing them solving puzzles and working as a team. And then, on April 22nd, 2002, everything changed.
It's the bus.
The bus is here. Goodbye, Steve. We'll miss you.
Bye-bye. Yeah, I'll miss you too.
Bye, Steve.
Joe, remember, Blue's paw prints will be on the clues.
Blue's Clues?
Exactly.
When I was a kid, right before this part, I'd always jump up from the couch, run to the TV, and pause the VCR right here. Dad would always get really mad. He'd tell me I might damage the video heads if I kept doing that. I still don't know what that means, but I guess I'll never really need to. Blue's Clues was produced and put on the air for several years, amassing well over 140 episodes. Each story served not only the goal of entertaining the audience and encouraging a healthy and happy imagination, but also teaching them something about the world. It created this fictional friend, this persona that we all spent time with, and through that connection, we learned so much. But of all those moments, this tends to be the one that stands out the greatest in the minds of children who grew up on this show. And I figured out why. Out of all of the show's attempts to tell those at home about music, or math, or to encourage problem solving, its most infamous lesson was also its most important and its most tragic. That time waits for no man. Throughout your life, you're going to meet a lot of people like Steve. Kind, caring people who make your day a little brighter, who you yearn to spend more time with because they're just that fun to be around. As your paths cross, you get to spend countless hours with them, and you find yourself seeing those moments as the best in your life. And then, sometimes, that has to end. Maybe they change. Maybe you change. Or maybe you're both the same. And despite how much you've loved the days that you've shared, something pulls you apart. One of you has to get on that bus and ride off into the sunset, going to continue their lives, but all on their own. And that can hurt. That can hurt a lot. But you have to keep moving. You have to find new people and new experiences to fill that void. Because pausing the tape and refusing to let the world turn can be just as heartbreaking.
Thanks again for all your help.
Now it's over, I'm dead and I haven't done anything that I want. Or I'm still alive and there's nothing I want to do.
Blue's Clues taught me that nothing is forever. And that's okay. Joe continued the show from here, and he did a pretty good job. I feel like Joe gets a bad rep. He was a good guy, but sadly everyone just remembers him as the rebound, which is so much less than he deserves to be seen as. On that note, I'll still take Kevin over him any day. It was around this time that I stopped watching The Backyardigans and started watching SpongeBob, which is a true sign of maturity, so I sort of lost track of the show at some point. I did, however, keep tabs on it out of curiosity. I guess the show's ratings must have also started to decline after this, because after I stopped watching, they added in a brand new gimmick. At the end of every show, Blue would jump into a box and would have her own world, where she became a puppet and could talk.
I can talk to you? Blue can talk. Wow.
Thanks, I hate it. I can handle badass standalone movie Indiana Jones Dora the Explorer, but I cannot handle Pocket Dimension Puppet Blue. That's just outside of what I can deal with. On that note, mad props to the puppeteers who worked on this, because puppets are so hard to work with, and the presentation of this show is incredible. Meanwhile, on my show, I filled in the gap in my beard with a Sharpie marker, and I'm already way over budget. From what I've seen in the news, Nickelodeon has been working on their own Blue's Clues reboot for about the last 6 months. They've got a new host, and I hear that Steve is going to come back for a cameo, and I think that's really cool, because Blue's Clues was a brilliant part of my experiences with media growing up, and perhaps it hasn't aged quite perfectly, but I think it's a great experience to give to a new generation of young viewers. And with that, now it's time for So Long. Thanks for coming along, and for doing your part. And I've already botched the song pretty badly, so bye guys.